All right. Hey, welcome everybody. Thanks for having me. It really started about 25 years ago when I was doing engineering work. At the end of it, I had my own company, a consulting company. It was quite stressful. I was in my early 30s and I was having a lot of difficulty sleeping. I would fall asleep fine, but I would wake up like at 2 in the morning and I'd be solidly awake from 2 to 3 or 2 to 4 in the morning. And eventually, I just got up and I started working in the middle of the night, and then I'd go back to sleep. And I kind of thought that was a bit unusual. But then I went to med school, and that went away, mostly because I was just so doggone busy. And then in residency, same thing. Even though I was working, weird nights sometimes. You're working 80 hours a week. So when you did sleep, you slept, pretty hard. But then I got back out of residency and I started working at St. Charles. So this is about 2015. And I started having sleep problems again. If I was on call or not on call, it didn't really matter. I'd wake at 2 in the morning and just be wide awake. And I went and saw my physician, and I think I got some trazodone, which didn't really help me all that much. Just made me groggy the next day. And he referred me for a sleep study. Said, well, you probably have sleep apnea. So I had all that done. I went, overnight and had all the pins and needles put in me, and I didn't have sleep apnea. But I remember telling the sleep doctor, I was like, if I could only just, have a schedule where I could just sleep, wake, and sleep again, I'd be golden. And she said, well, she didn't make any comment, right? She didn't try to normalize it or let me know that it might be normal. And so, that's where I started looking into it. And then, funny enough, after I came to Columbia Care, I took over Clearview and Riverbridge about a year and a half ago. And a lot of the complaints that I would get from clients and through staff was that somebody wasn't sleeping. And usually it was they would wake in the middle of the night and be awake. And so I prescribed like trazodone, hydroxyzine, or Benadryl, or doxepin, all of these things. And they might work, but then the doses were going up. And so, I just kind of came back to the sleep issue. And so that's kind of what prompted this talk, really. It's how the history of sleep really developed, and how knowing about it might be able to reduce the anxiety. So what's the problem, right? So I already alluded to that, right? It's in the case of the clients, like at Riverbridge or Clearview, or an outpatient client, they'd say, I have insomnia, right? I woke up at 2 in the morning. I couldn't get back to sleep. They relate it to anxiety. Anxiety makes the sleep worse. Their lack of sleep makes the anxiety worse. They start to, ruminate on it. Tomorrow's ruined. Something's wrong with me. And that distress really, comes from not necessarily being awake, but what we tell ourselves about being awake. That led me to do a little research, and I came across a couple gentlemen who I'm going to speak about in a second, but there really is a forgotten pattern of sleep. So it used to be, in the 1800s and early 1900s and 1700s, and before that, most people would often sleep twice, right? They would go and have a first sleep, which was 3, 4, 5 hours. They would get up, and they called that the watch. And then they would return to a second sleep. They didn't panic. There was no diagnosis. There was no shame. It's just that was almost an expected period. Well, what did people do during that period? Well, they read, they prayed, they reflected, they talked with one another, they wrote. I came across one paper that was, well, it was some journals, and it was in Old England, and people would actually get up and do business on the street from like 2 to 3 or 2 to 4, and then in the morning, and go back to bed. But it was, again, it was kind of an expectation. It was normal. Well, interestingly enough, I came across a couple of these gentlemen. So there was a gentleman, Mr. Roger, yeah, I think it's Ekirk. I think that's how you pronounce it. He's in his 70s now. I'm not sure how much he's still doing, but he's a professor, was a professor at Virginia Tech, and he really started getting into the the research of pre-industrial sleep patterns. In fact, he's written several books on it. One's called Sleep We Have Lost, the pre-industrial slumber in the British Isles. There's another one that I've read, and it's very good. I'm not here selling books, by the way, but it's called At a Day's Close, Night and Times Past. And he talks about this, and he looks into the history, of sleep patterns and, what's changed. This other gentleman, Thomas Weir, he's a psychiatrist, actually, a researcher and author. He kind of came at it from the other way, right? Science. So he was one of the, people who talked about, melatonin and how that hormone is secreted when there's less light, and that's responsible for that circadian rhythm, right? And often people will take melatonin to help them sleep. But he found that if you removed artificial light, people would often return to this period where they would sleep 3 to 5 hours. They had 1 to 2 hours off, wake, and then another 3 to 5 hours. And if you do the math on that, that's 6 to 10 hours, or the average, would be 8, right? And so that it's interesting how that comes up with what we think about as an 8-hour day. As a side, Dr. Weir worked with a gentleman named Norman Rosenthal, and they were actually one of the first people to talk about light therapy with seasonal affective disorder. So there's a connection there as well. Well, what changed? Well, I've kind of already alluded to that, right? I mean, it used to be that people would go to bed when it got dark, and usually a little bit earlier. They'd sleep, wake, and then sleep, and then wake again when it got light. Well, entered a light bulb, right? So now we have artificial light, and we're staying up later, we're getting up earlier, and we're working at different times. And that middle period really in history just got smaller and smaller and smaller, compressed, and then eventually went away. And I don't expect that it's ever going to come back, right? Now we got computers, TVs, cell phones, we got AI coming into the picture. So, who knows what the future will hold. Well, the reason I mention all this is because there really is a clinical application. And I don't think you have to be a clinician necessarily to help clients, whether it be in HSU facilities or outpatient, get through problems with sleep, especially if they're experiencing the pattern that I'm talking about. So what I've tried to do is I try to normalize it, right? That helps reduce anxiety, eliminate or minimize panic. I encourage calm activities at night. I do say don't get on the computer or your phone. I can tell you, going back to my discussion about being an engineer, I would used to get up and do computer work. I still do that a little bit, but what I try to do now is I make a list on paper of things that I have to do the next day. And sometimes it might be return an email to, this person, and don't forget about this, and I'll just make a list. And that way, when I get up at 2 a.m, that list is there, and I grab a pen and I expand on it. I've often written an email on paper, and then I'm up for an hour and a half or so, and I get tired, and I go to bed. Well, what about caregivers, right? I mean, we got clinicians, we have caregivers. It applies for us too, and like I said, I get out of bed. I try to keep lights dim. I sometimes I'll read. I do try to avoid my phone. And again, for me at least, often that's that I'll just get tired and I'll go back to bed, and and I'll have a nice next day. So what's the takeaway? Well, again, I've alluded to this. I think that waking up in the middle of the night and not being able to sleep for an hour or two is not a disorder, right? I think it's normal. It's based in our history. That anxiety can make sleep worse, right? If you're worried about that you're abnormal. I think the goal really isn't perfect sleep. The goal is less fear when sleep isn't perfect. And I think what I've tried to do is realize that sleep can be more flexible than we often believe, right? It's not going to bed, sleeping 8 hours, and getting up, at least for a lot of people. And it doesn't always require drugs. And like I said, I deal with that. I strategize ahead of time, and I take care of that with a plan and pen and paper. So that's about it, really, for this presentation. Curious, if other people have had clients or even loved ones that are anxious because they woke up, in the middle of the night. Do you think this would be helpful to, reframe it in useful setting for, especially like residential clients? And how might this apply to our own wellness?
So I'm really glad you did this. Not even for the application to our residents, but I personally struggle with anxiety and have my entire life, and I sleep probably an average of 3 or 4 hours a night. And I do that probably magical sleep from like 10 to midnight and then up and down the rest of the night. And I've always thought that was something terribly wrong. And I'm going to drop dead eventually from it. But I think it relieves a little bit of anxiety knowing that it's not that abnormal, and that it's that the idea that like maybe I don't know that I've ever gotten 8 hours of sleep in my entire life consistent. So I appreciate you doing this. And again, I think it has applications not only for our residents, but also for us, or at least for me.
It was fascinating when I was looking at this, when I came across these journals, and they were just talking about, in London, going out on the street and like literally a bunch of people doing business between 2 and 4 in the morning. It was absolutely fascinating. I mean, it's obviously something we can't do in necessarily in a digital world, but it helped me out too. I was like, whoa, that's very interesting.
I think this directly relates to our residents. I've worked with a couple who have had manic episodes in their past. So whenever they have broken sleep, especially if it's more than, one night, they start to get very, very alarmed. And I think it's helpful to help them look at the context, to talk about other symptoms, because sometimes they often want to know, does this mean an impending crisis is looming over me, which you can imagine just ramps up the anxiety. So knowing that it can be normalized.
Really appreciate it too, being a person who exactly has that sleep pattern. And it kind of reminds me of the book called Don't Believe Everything You Think. I think it's by Joseph Wen. It's a really good book. It's interesting. And it really talks about how we do have an impact from a situation or event, but it sometimes can pale in comparison to how we overthink about that situation or event. And that has actually much more impact on us than the actual thing. So that it just was a good reminder to me that, like, if you can take away the worrying or take the worrying out of a thing, then you can usually take away the stress and then also probably sleep better. So just a really good reminder for me as well, because I struggle with sleep as well.